Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our first community development activity back since the summer break. As always, if you are not new here, you know that we like to wait just for a minute or two just to have everybody coming in, settle in. Otherwise, if you're new, we take a few minutes every beginning of every community activity development activity to just give everybody a moment to come through. Thank you all for joining us. Like I said, this is our first activity back since the summer break, and our first activity back since the beginning of the new academic year. We're very, very excited to be starting. Oh, thank you very much, Francesca. We're honored to have you. We're very excited to be starting off with a presentation topic that is very, very, very heavily discussed at the moment and very important for the open science ecosystem, especially being, especially with having peer review week starting next week. This is a very opportune time to be discussing this topic. So we're just going to wait for just a few more, seconds, just to make sure that everybody who's in the waiting room is settling in okay. But just bear with the silence for just a few more moments. And in the meantime, do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you're coming in from. Tell us why you're interested in peer review, specifically open peer review. Yeah, please feel free. We love to know who is coming back and who's a new attendee and whatnot. Okay, so I think now is a good time to get started. Thank you all for joining our community development activity for September. We're going to be talking about integrity and trust in research and doing an introduction to open peer review. And we're going to be hosting this event in partnership with F1000. So we're very excited to be welcoming you all today. Next slide, please. So just a quick note before we get started, we're going to be running through some housekeeping points. First of all, in case you are joining us in the middle of your workday or while you're studying, we hope you know at this point that the Zoom window is movable, so you can move us a little bit to the side and have us with you, while you're multitasking. Another point is that if you feel at any point that myself, or the presenters are speaking too fast, please do raise your hand, not actually, just with the Zoom feature, so that we can know to slow down. Please also use the chat to introduce yourself, of course, and if there are any technical issues that you're facing or anything that you need us to support you on immediately, or leave a comment, whatever you'd like, please feel free to do that on the chat, but please do reserve your questions for the Q&A box, which you can find in the Zoom bar below. We're only answering questions that are going to be coming in from the Q&A box. So if you put a question in the chat and you find that we haven't answered it, it's usually because it's not in the Q&A. So please do use these features separately, and properly, so that we can get to all of you as needed. Next slide, please. So before we get started, just a little bit about the forum. If you are not new here, then you already know about all the initiatives that we do and what we stand for as an organization. But if you are new here, then a little bit about us. We are a nonprofit membership organization who is dedicated to supporting the advancement of open science policies and practices in research communities and institutions across the Arab region. We are very dedicated to bolstering a healthy ecosystem of research and higher education, and we believe that there's no way to do that without including open science as a core of our foundation. And then a little bit about what we do. We have three main initiatives that we work on. One is the community development activities, which you know about, obviously, as you are joining us here today. And these include workshops, webinars, working groups, and the discussion forums that we have on our website, as well as, you know, any new up and coming things that we may be doing soon to bolster more discussion. Another thing that we do is that we produce resources that cater to the needs of a very particular region with its own contextual issues and challenges and opportunities, which include, you know, guidance resources, and creating translations and creating new glossaries of words that we should be using in Arabic for open science initiatives and policies that we're discussing. And then as well, hopefully we're going to be running a journal very soon, so keep your eyes open for that. And finally, our annual forum, which is actually going to be hosted in October this year in Abu Dhabi. So stay tuned to find out a bit more about that. But that is, of course, one of our biggest initiatives that we do. So now, enough about me and about my voice. We're going to move on to our speakers. We have with us today from F1000, Molly Cranston, who's the editorial content manager over there. And we have Eleanor Rose Papas, who is the senior editorial operations and peer review manager. Thank you guys for coming and joining us today. We're very excited to have you. And they are the ones who are going to be leading the discussion about how we can drive trust and integrity in research, and teaching us hopefully a little bit more about the open peer review process. Thank you guys for joining us. I will pass over now. Feel free to introduce yourselves.
Hi everyone, many thanks for inviting us, and thanks to you all for joining us for this webinar about open peer review. Before we start, I'd like to quickly introduce myself and my colleague. I am Molly Cranston, the editorial content manager at F1000, and I oversee the team that handles all articles submitted to the F1000 platforms as part of our editorial team. My colleague is Eleanor Rose Papas, who is the Senior Editorial Operations and Peer Review Manager for F1000, and Elle oversees the team that handles peer review for all articles published on our F1000 platforms. So today we're going to provide an overview to open peer review. We'll also be referring to open peer review on the slides as OPR, so just so that you know, if you see that, that also means open peer review. In this webinar, which will run for approximately 45 minutes, we'll cover what open peer review is and its importance, discuss the benefits and drawbacks of open peer review, both as an author and reviewer, and we'll finish with showing examples where open peer review is used today, and we'll go into a bit more detail on its use in practice. We'll then finish the webinar with approximately 15 minutes of questions, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box. So first up, what is open peer review? Open peer review can mean many different things to different people. And a systematic review in 2017 identified that there are 122 separate definitions of open peer review, and the authors of the article were able to split that into 7 common themes. So it can make it really difficult to discuss open peer review, as there's so many different definitions flying around, and one publisher's open peer review model may operate very differently to another. So on this slide, you can see the kind of main different things of open peer review that were identified in that research in 2017. And there's a link to the research article that we're talking about at the bottom of the slide. The 3 in bold blue are the most common themes, and 99% of those 122 definitions include these 3 themes. So we're going to take these 3 themes, open identities, open reports, and open participation, as the core tenets of open peer review, and I'll take you through each of those individually. So firstly, open identities. In its most basic form, this is simply the removal of anonymization in the publication process. So that's also known as blinding in peer review. Traditional publishing models often use either single anonymous review, where the authors don't know who the reviewers are, or double anonymous review, where neither the authors nor the reviewers know who is who. Anonymized processes do not necessarily mean people can't be identified. So just because a process has been anonymized, it does not mean that someone cannot identify you. So you should never assume anonymity, and anonymization has been found to fail at least 20% of the time for articles published. So with open identities, this problem goes away. Everyone is aware of who everyone is. The authors, reviewers, and editors all know each other's identities. And depending on the publisher, this may happen at different stages of the process. Sometimes identities are available from the beginning, and sometimes authors only learn of reviewer names when the article is accepted or even when it's published. Reviewer names may also be published alongside the article as well, so that readers know who reviewed. So this allows readers to feel reassured that experts have reviewed the article and can look up the named reviewers to verify them. And for multidisciplinary articles, this is even more valuable, as readers can see whether the peer review covered all the subject areas presented in the paper. So why is open identities beneficial? On the face of it, I appreciate that it can seem quite scary to publish your name against a peer review report. However, it makes the peer review process more human, encourages the discussion, and adds context to both the article and the peer review reports. It also ensures that reviewers and authors are all accountable for their article, report, and responses, which we have found presents the majority of inappropriate or unkind reviews that occur outside of open peer review. So moving on to open reports, the second tenet. This is where the peer review reports themselves are published alongside the article and are available to readers. So depending on the publisher, you may find that only a section of the report has been published, or the full peer review report will be published. Usually the reports are attached to the article. However, some publishers will go the extra step and they will assign DOIs to the peer review reports, which allows citation of them as a separate piece of academic literature. Publishing peer review reports is valuable because there's so much work that goes into writing a report. And in more traditional publishing models, this isn't fully recognised. The peer reviewer's effort isn't fully recognised. So I think the average amount of time academics spend writing a peer review is around 4 hours or more. And they are a significant undertaking and contain a huge amount of commentary and discussion on the article in question. So while peer review reports may contain requests to change things, they also have questions surrounding why things were done a certain way, suggestions for additional avenues of research, citations to supporting or conflicting literature, and many other things. They provide vital context to the peer review process, and by publishing them, they are both accessible and creditable. So thirdly, open participation. This is where the academics, authors, and reviewers involved with the process are encouraged to interact directly. For example, conversations happening between the reviewers or between the authors and the reviewers. So in traditional publishing models, the peer review is all done behind closed doors. And so authors and reviewers aren't given a chance to interact directly. It normally goes through the editors. So open participation can help remove confusion in how to interpret parts of an article or a peer review report, and it also aids collaboration. For example, a reviewer may have asked for additional analysis to be done on the article in their peer review report, and with open participation, authors are able to openly correspond with the reviewer to ask what exactly is required and even how the reviewer would suggest they go about the new analysis. Often the publisher will help moderate and guide these interactions. Okay, so now that I've given a basic understanding of open peer review, the big question is, why should we use it? So open and transparent practices are important, and there is a large and global movement towards more open and transparent practices. One of the main reasons transparency and openness are important is that it allows for more information to be available. Peer reviewers' thoughts on an article are valuable, as I previously said, and are a useful resource for readers and other researchers. Secondly, open research means there is a more chance of verification and validation of the research. For example, publishing the underlying data openly alongside an article allows others to check it and reuse it. When this type of information is available, it can be used in research to improve publishing and peer review in a data-driven way. And of course, let's not forget that open access content grants everyone access to important research, rather than it being locked away behind a paywall. Thirdly, open practices also allow academics to validate information that they are shown and encourage discussion. You can check whether the data or statistics used seem appropriate and correct, or whether a named peer reviewer was suitable to review the article. It's easier to spot, discuss, and rectify misunderstandings with the ability to discuss things openly, and future readers can also see those discussions and reach their own conclusions. Finally, and in some ways the most important, open practices allow recognition. As stated before, we know that peer review reports can take hours to write, and peer reviewer time is so precious. Open peer review allows academics to gain recognition for the hard work they put into writing peer review reports, without which academic publishing cannot happen. So moving forward, we'll be using the term open peer review to mean open identities and open reports as a minimum, as these form the majority of all open peer review models. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics of open peer review, we will discuss the benefits and drawbacks of this particular type of peer review. So we'd love to say that open peer review fixes every problem that is present in peer review at the moment, or indeed publishing, but that wouldn't be accurate. Like most models, it has its benefits and its drawbacks. However, we believe that it solves most of the issues that traditional publication models currently face. So the major benefit of open peer review is showing whether or not sufficient peer review took place. Predatory publishing, as you know, is on the rise, and where articles are published with little or even no peer review at all. And even in more legitimate publications, there have been instances where only one peer review report was received for an article. Typically, publishers will ask for a minimum of 2 peer review reports. Or an academic editor has just overruled the peer reviewer decisions and published an article regardless of if the peer reviewer said that it shouldn't be published. With open peer review, there's no need to take on trust that peer review took place because the information is available to the reader straight away. You can see who reviewed, you can see what they wrote, and perhaps most importantly, you can make your own decision based on the report that you can read. Open peer review empowers readers by giving them the tools they need to judge the peer review quality for themselves. It also allows readers to see how suitable the reviewers were to evaluate the article. Are they researchers in the field? What are their viewpoints on this topic? And do they have any competing interests in reviewing? For example, if a reviewer worked at a pharmaceutical company that produces a competing drug to the one discussed in the article, they may have had conflicting motivations when they provided their review. So readers can determine whether or not reviewers had other sources of bias. For example, if they were close collaborators with the authors or they've worked with them previously. These things should of course be detected by the publisher before the peer review process is completed. However, with open peer review, readers can verify for themselves if the reviewer was able to provide an independent review. Finally, as I touched upon earlier, open peer review enables recognition of the work that reviewers do. With a peer review report published and citable online, it's more obvious just how valuable the hard work that reviewers contribute to the publishing ecosystem is and why it should be rewarded. People who write good peer review reports should be applauded, and yet because of how traditional models work, where the peer review is all behind closed doors, it's often hard to demonstrate the quality of review that academics are writing. So with open peer review, that report is not only available, but it can be used as evidence to show one's contribution to the academic publishing system. So, of course, open peer review isn't without its share of problems. While it solves many issues, it also brings to light some problems that are obscured by traditional peer review models. So this doesn't mean that these drawbacks aren't also in traditional peer review models, but it kind of brings the drawbacks to the surface in open peer review. So, for example, unfortunately, sometimes peer review reports can contain inappropriate, biased, or unkind feedback. This is unacceptable. However, in an open system, this could be embarrassing to not only the author, but also the reviewer who wrote those things, as their name is publicly attached to their peer review report. That said, at F1000, our experience is that in open peer review, we receive much less comments with poor tone than in traditional systems, probably because having your name attached to a peer review report will make you accountable for what you've written. So, and we can't speak for other publishers, but at F1000, we would never publish a report that contained inappropriate comments. We would always ask the reviewer to rephrase what they've said or not publish the report. So similarly, some reviewers may be concerned about reviewing publicly, especially with their name attached. It might be that they don't, excuse me, it might be that they do not wish to damage their relationship with the author, or they don't have the subject expertise to feel confident in writing something publicly, or maybe they just have an affiliation that they would not be comfortable with their views on their topic being shared online. These are all very real concerns, but we would argue that they are not just reasons to decline to review openly, but they all demonstrate conflicts of interest that in reviewing an article, they probably shouldn't review an article even if the peer review is open or closed. There's never anything wrong with declining to review due to a conflict of interest, and it's important to remember to always decline a review if you feel that you have a conflict of interest, regardless of the peer review model being used. So now that I've gone through open peer review in general, I'm going to pass to my colleague Elle, who will talk you through where open peer review is available today.
Thanks, Molly, and hi folks. I'm Elle, and I'm the Senior Editorial Operations Manager and Peer Review Manager for F1000. As we're speaking on open practices today, it would be remiss of me to begin without a quick conflict of interest statement. I've been working in open peer review for just over a decade now, and I absolutely believe it's the way forward for academic publishing, solving many of the problems faced in the traditional publishing model. Peer review is vital to academia. It validates and improves the literature so that others can build upon it. And so it astounds me that the majority of peer review is inaccessible and that it's lost after an article has been published. Open peer review really allows us to shine a light on the contributions that so many researchers make to academia that have historically not been recognised, and also gives us a new avenue to research peer review itself and find ways to improve both the processes and its purpose. So where is open peer review available today? Many people treat it as a niche and new concept. However, it's worth bearing in mind that publishers have been using some form of open peer review for many years now. As Molly has mentioned, open peer review appears in many different forms, but the two main aspects are open identities and open reports. I'm not going to be able to go through all examples of open peer review that are used today. There are quite a few, but I hope to draw your attention to some examples of established journals operating successful open peer review models. So a number of nature journals, including Nature and Nature Communications, have open report models. It's optional for some of their journals, and authors can opt in, and it's mandatory in others. Articles with open reports contain a section in their published article for peer review, which lists the names of reviewers who chose to be identified and credits other anonymous reviewers in an example of optional open identities. If you look in the supplementary information section, there is then a copy of the peer review file, which is a PDF containing both the reviewer comments and the author's response to them. At Frontiers, while the reports aren't published and posting them elsewhere is prohibited, published papers have a section naming both reviewers and the editor in an example of open identities. However, it is worth bearing in mind that at Frontiers, only those who endorsed the publication of the article are listed. If someone recommended rejection of the article, their name is not disclosed. Frontiers also use an open participation model of open peer review. And this is during their interactive review phase of the peer review process, where authors and reviewers are able to discuss the article to ensure that their concerns are addressed. BMJ is an example of a journal that uses both open identities and open reports as part of its publication model. Every published paper has a peer review tab that provides a PDF copy of the article's history. The initial peer review reports and reviewer identities are available in the first decision file, and you can view the author's response to these in the author response PDF as well. And of course, there's the F1000 model, which, as well as F1000 Research, has platforms such as Wellcome Open Research, Routledge Open Research, Open Research Africa, and Open Research Europe. F1000 articles have both open identities and open reports, the latter of which directly determine the peer review outcome of an article. The peer review history is available in the open peer review bar on the right-hand side of the article page, and it includes information on the reviewers and where they're affiliated, and an at-a-glance summary of their thoughts on that version of the article. Of course, while a summary is useful, it's the full report that is of most interest to people curious about the peer review for an article. And so all reports are available by clicking the Read button beneath each report. So, looking in a bit more detail, here's an example of a published peer review on F1000. The reviewer details are clearly available. The report itself is citable independently of the article, and both the report's contents and the metadata are included in the article's XML to facilitate data mining and therefore further research on peer review. I've only included a section of the peer review reports here, but please do feel free to look up the full version online. The report itself is displayed alongside the article, so it's possible to scroll through both simultaneously and reference sections mentioned in the peer review report in the same window, helping both readers and authors of the article. What you may also notice here is that you can see that 2 people wrote this peer review report. We encourage co-reviewers at F1000 not only to support early career researchers to get involved in peer review, but also to recognise that they are already involved in peer review. A study a few years ago showed that roughly 50% of early career researchers had ghost-written a peer review report, meaning that they had done the work and not received credit for it. By making sure that there is an option for multiple reviewers to be named, we help ensure that everybody is receiving credit for the work that they have performed. I feel at this point, it is important to draw attention to a difference between F1000 and the other models that I've shown today. And that is that articles on F1000 platforms are published before peer review rather than after. This may seem a little surprising, but there is a good reason behind it. As I'm sure some of you have experienced, and as much as we would all like for it to be faster, peer review can take months. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's better that it takes a little bit longer and that experts have the time to properly assess the article. But especially in cutting-edge areas of research, these months can be a painful delay. By publishing articles first, similar to how they might be made available as preprints elsewhere, and then ensuring they undergo peer review in an open and transparent manner, we prevent that delay, and authors, reviewers, and readers have access to the most current version with the most current peer review reports. Authors are able to revise the article according to the feedback they've received from reviewers, which is published as a new version, creating a living publication. So Molly's talked about the benefits of open peer review, but how does it work in practice? And how do we ensure that we are preserving integrity? In the same way that different publishers have different models, we also have different ways in which we facilitate them. So I'm going to focus in on F1000 practices. However, it's worth bearing in mind that many other publishers operate in similar ways. I would always recommend checking publishers' policy and guidelines pages to be certain the model they are operating. Firstly, at F1000, we differentiate between user comments, which are open to all academics, and the formal peer review process. Despite the reviewers being identified openly, all communication with them is also via our editorial office, and authors are asked not to contact reviewers directly to avoid biasing their reports. This also allows us to ensure that everyone invited to peer review articles has been checked by the editorial team to ensure that they are suitable to review a paper. Once someone agrees to provide a report, there are resources available to assist them, including our peer review report form. And reviewers are, of course, able to read any existing peer review reports for the article they are reviewing. Authors are alerted to every new peer review report, and when their response in the form of a new version is published, the original reviewers are approached to request that they provide an updated review. When a report is published, it is made available immediately to authors and readers. However, each report is checked by our editorial team first. This is to make sure that they meet our code of conduct, which helps us make sure that articles are being reviewed thoroughly and fairly. As Molly mentioned earlier, if the editorial team do find something that we need clarification on or an issue with tone, we will always contact the reviewer and try to work with them to address it before the report is published. So the F1000 Code of Conduct for reviewers is simple, but it provides a baseline for what we expect from our peer reviewers. And this is very similar to other publishers as well, especially those with open reports and open identities, models of open peer review. There is more detail available on our website, but this is for additional clarity, and it helps keep the peer review process fair to everyone, including our authors. We ask that the submitted peer review reports demonstrate that the article has been read fully, avoiding generic feedback, that they are thorough and specific, so that authors know which areas of their article may need improvement and what the reviewer would suggest, and that any critiques are made in a helpful manner. Derogatory comments or tone are not acceptable, and our editorial team would always make sure that these are revised before the peer review report is published. Overall, we ask that reviewers comment on articles in the way that they would like people to peer review their own papers. As a general rule of thumb, I always suggest that if you wouldn't be happy saying something to your colleague, you also probably shouldn't be writing that in a peer review report either. Now, the publishing process is key to academic research, and preserving integrity is one of the most important roles of academic publishers. This, therefore, makes preserving the integrity of the peer review process vital, as you can't have publishing without peer review. Ultimately, readers need to have confidence in the peer review process, At F1000 and many other publishers as well, we achieve this by ensuring that every invited reviewer has been checked to make sure that we are contacting the right person, that person has expertise in the needed areas of research, and that they have no conflicts of interest that would prevent them from being able to give an independent and objective assessment of the article. There is often a dedicated space on all peer review reports for any remaining conflicts of interest to be declared. So that, for example, if a reviewer received funding from the same organisation that funded the article, this information is available to readers. And of course, the great thing about using open identities and open reports is that, as Molly mentioned, unlike in traditional anonymized publishing models, we don't need to take on trust that peer review took place, that the reviewers were suitable, and that the reports were thorough. All of that information is available up front to the readers. Anyone is able to look at an article and verify for themselves that the peer review was conducted fairly and with integrity. So, what do you do if you receive an invitation to review an article in an open peer review model? Honestly, it's very similar to what you should do for any peer review invitation. First, and most importantly, read the invitation and the information you've been given about the article. Is it a subject area you can provide an expert opinion in? You'll need to use your expertise to provide detailed feedback. And so if it's not a field in which you're comfortable doing so, then you should decline the invitation to review. This is especially important in open identities peer review, because you will be listed publicly as an expert in that subject area. Speaking of accepting and declining reviews, this leads nicely on to our next tip, which is to please let the journal know as soon as possible whether or not you're able to review. I know it can be really tempting to ignore emails requesting reviews, especially when things are busy. But not only does letting the journal know allow them to approach other reviewers more promptly, but it also helps prevent you from being sent reminder emails. If you are available to review, the next thing to check is whether you've any competing interests. And again, let the journal know. Different publishers have different criteria for the level of competing interests acceptable. And so you should always declare something that might affect your ability to be impartial. This could potentially save you a lot of time. Otherwise, you risk writing a peer review report that the journal wouldn't be able to accept due to a conflict of interest. Finally, and not to be forgotten, always check the journal's peer review policies when you agree to review. Is your name going to be made available to the authors or the readers? And at what stage? Is your report going to be published publicly? And if not, do you have permission to publish it elsewhere? What does your peer review report determine? It's really important to make sure you're aware of any restrictions you'd be under and whether you're comfortable with all the journal's policies before agreeing to review. So, onto the report itself. How do you write it? I'd love to go into a lot of detail on this, but in the interest of time, I'll just give a quick overview of the things that are often most important when peer reviewing. These again apply to all models of peer review. However, one of the things that we hear most is hesitance in being involved in open peer review due to lack of confidence in writing quality peer review reports. So when you first start reviewing an article, I would recommend first reading it through and making notes on your thoughts, and then going back and looking through again in more detail, section by section, and compiling your notes into a full report. As you are writing your report, I would always keep in mind that the aim is to provide constructive feedback on the article's quality and how it could be improved. Of course, one of the great things about open peer review that we've perhaps not mentioned too much yet today is that it is perfect for training as well. I'm not going to do a full training session, don't worry, but I am going to use some reports as examples for the following tips. So there are a wide variety of different article types available, and it's important to know which one of those the article has been written as in order to provide helpful feedback. For example, if the article is an opinion article or a review, it would usually not be appropriate to request that additional experiments are performed. If you're unsure, have a look at the article guidelines on the journal's website. Or if the journal operates an open reports model, you can also look at the other published peer review reports. In the review I've shown here, the reviewer has taken into account that they are reviewing a data note. This article type describes a data set, and so contains detailed methods and a description of why the data set has been generated, but there is no analysis or conclusions. As such, you can see that this reviewer has therefore focused on the value of the data set described, whether the methods and materials are appropriate, and whether the data sets themselves are usable. While part of peer reviewing is providing constructive feedback, that doesn't mean that everything you draw attention to has to be areas that need improving. Highlighting the strengths of an article is just as important and helps the authors know which areas they've got right. Conversely, only drawing attention to the strengths of an article would mean that potential weaknesses might not be addressed, resulting in lower quality articles than may have been possible with thorough peer review. This is often one of the pitfalls that we see when people are reviewing openly, and is definitely something to avoid. The peer review report highlighted here starts with a summary of both the strengths and the areas which need improving, drawing attention to these aspects of the article and making sure that both focuses have been covered. It's also a great example of structure in a peer review report. As I'm sure you've experienced with peer review reports for your own papers, structuring the report makes it much more helpful for the authors, and if the report is being published, for the readers of the article as well. There are a few different ways you can do this, so choose the most appropriate to your writing style and the article being reviewed. Generally speaking, it's helpful to divide the article into sections: abstracts, introduction, conclusions, etc., in order to help find the area under discussion easier, and also to divide your feedback into major and minor, so it's clear the seriousness of the issue you are highlighting. This report, for example, has not only broken the article into sections, but then subdivided them further, allowing the reader to navigate the article and find the affected areas immediately. So please remember that you've been invited to review an article as a subject expert and focus your attention accordingly. If you're having difficulty understanding an article, or if you notice an important typo, then please include this in your report, but avoid the temptation to copy edit the paper. It's better to focus on the content of the article. If you're concerned about the readability, then often it's best to simply recommend a copy edit as part of your report. And these three examples all show a quick, polite mention that further edits are needed to the article as a whole, without making assumptions about the authors or copy editing the article themselves. Peer reviewers are not generally expected to look for plagiarism or image manipulation, that is examined elsewhere in the publication process. But you might find that you notice something when looking closely at an article. You may have already spotted that I don't have an example peer review report for this. And that's because if you are concerned there might be an ethical issue with an article, for example, if you suspect plagiarism, image manipulation, or unethical research practices, please don't include this as part of your reports and instead contact the editorial office immediately. This allows the team to start looking into your concerns straight away, especially if you've included all the necessary information. And of course, just to reiterate that very key point at the end of this list, write your reviews as you would like someone else to review your article. Keep your reports constructive, professional, and objective. And this is advice you should be following, whether or not you are reviewing for an open peer review publisher. But it's especially important if you are reviewing in an open system, because your report may be made publicly available and it may be attached to your name as well. So hopefully now you're all a bit more familiar with open peer review models, more confident in how to write a peer review report that may be published or may have your identity attached, and keen to get more involved. There are a few ways to do this, and the most direct is, of course, publishing papers in venues with open peer review models and volunteering as a reviewer for them also. In addition, signing your name when peer reviewing helps normalise open peer review practices, although please do check whether the journal allows this practice beforehand. Finally, if you're still feeling a little bit uncertain on writing peer review reports openly, or having your name revealed as part of the process, I'd recommend taking a look at the resources that journals offer to help build your peer review skills. For example, training courses, webinars, or the guidelines that they provide for reviewers. And of course, look at peer review reports that other people have written on publishers with open peer review to get an idea of how others write theirs. I would happily talk about peer review all day, but in the interest of time, I think now would be a good point to open the floor for questions. If you would like to follow up after this webinar, both my and Molly's email addresses are currently on display. Oh, they've disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This was such a wonderfully comprehensive presentation. We actually had someone in the chat just now say the presentation's too comprehensive, so they have no questions because it's too much knowledge. But we do luckily have some questions. I do see some people writing their questions in the chat. Please do just migrate your questions over to the Q&A so that we can get to all of your questions. I'm going to be very firm about this. Questions are only answered if they are in the Q&A box, so please do just send those over. So we do have some right now. The first one is, what is the index of F1000 and the score, if there is one?
So F1000 is not currently indexed in Web of Science, which I assume is what that question is about. But we are indexed in Scopus and in PubMed as well, and a number of other sort of smaller indexes. I'm afraid I don't know the values off the top of my head, and it will also differ between our different platforms. So we have F1000 Research, Welcome Open Research, for example, will possibly have different index of scores.
Great. So I hope that answered the question. If it didn't, then Mr. Raphael, please do feel free to send back a question to clarify. Moving on, we have our next question is, in your system, will the authors be charged for paper review process?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
In your system, will the authors be charged for the paper review process?
Yes, so publishing with F1000 Research, there is an APC attached to this, and that covers everything from the checks that our in-house team do, which is Molly's team, which she could go into more detail if she'd want in a moment. The production process, so making sure the paper is published online, and also the peer review process as well, and all of the support that we give to authors and reviewers as part of that.
Great. And then would the reviewers also have to pay?
No fee to the reviewers.
Just in case that was where the question was heading. Okay, great. There are two questions in the chat that I'm trying to avoid answering because they're not supposed to be in the chat. But in the interest of time, I will cave and I will give you what you want, everybody. So Bani Aurora is asking, what if the authors resist the open review policy? Should the consent to open peer review not be mutual?
So that will depend on the journal where the authors are publishing. And this is why I would always recommend that you check the policies of a journal before you submit. Some of them do have optional open peer review policies. So you would be able to choose when submitting there. For others, it is mandatory. And so I would say that authors choose whether or not to take part in open peer review by choosing where they're publishing. Please don't publish in mandatory open peer review journals if you do not want your paper to be openly peer reviewed.
That's, I think, a very fair.
Yeah.
Also, I want to say thank you to Bani because she actually did move her question to the Q&A box, so I appreciate that. Next question we have is, do peer reviewers get paid when they peer review? Is that something that they would get paid for?
It would very much depend on the journal. It's not standard practice to pay peer reviewers. And a lot of that is because there are sort of quite significant ethical issues there which haven't yet been fully resolved. No one's found a way to smooth those out yet. So, for example, do you pay for speed or do you pay for a quality review? And how do you balance the conflict between those two things? And how do you make sure that everyone is being invited fairly and that you don't have one or two people who are continuously being invited to review and the only ones seeing those payments? So it's something that a lot of publishers are exploring and trying to find a way to do well and right, but doing it properly and ethically has to be the priority there.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. And then we have another question, which is, will you give a waiver fee for developing countries? So I think it's, I think this question kind of links to the, do you have to pay to get your paper reviewed? So basically, are there, you know, platforms out there that allow authors to get their papers peer reviewed without them having to pay a huge lump sum? Because obviously we all know that authors don't all come from the same starting point, and there are a lot of barriers when it comes to being a researcher as is. So I think different more the base of the question.
Different journals and publishers will have different policies. So again, I'd recommend always checking. But I think, Molly, if you'd like to detail the F1000 one specifically, just to give an example.
Yeah, sure. So as Elle said, like check the guidelines on where you want to submit, but we offer World Bank waivers. So World Bank divides countries into low-income countries and middle-income countries, and we offer a full waiver for those determined as low-income and 50% discount on article processing charges for those listed as middle-income, and the details are all on our website for that.
Yeah, and I think that's fairly standard. A lot of publishers will offer the same, so do always check the journal APC page.
That's incredible. I think that's definitely going to be very helpful knowledge for a lot of people who are, especially from this region and from the regions that a forum is trying to target. I think that's very, very, very useful information to have. We did have another question in the chat, and I'm going to go for it because we are getting a little short on time. But the question is, I suppose, from the reviewer's side, how can one go about getting an invitation to review articles? I'm assuming this question is specifically for F1000. Do you have to fill in a form and send your CV or bio to match with similar disciplines to the reviewer's area of specialization or expertise?
Yep, so on F1000 specifically, for each of our platforms, you can sign up as a volunteer reviewer, and that's done by simply emailing us a quick form and a copy of your CV, just so that we can sort of see where your areas of expertise are, your career stage, and also to make sure that if we were to invite you for an individual article, that you don't have any conflicts of interest with the authors of that paper. On a wider scale, volunteer for other journals as well, obviously, but also make sure that your online profiles are visible and up to date. So, for example, your faculty page, make sure your contact information is there, make sure your subject areas are clearly displayed, and also consider signing up for services like ORCID or the Web of Science Reviewer Recognition Tool, which used to be called Publons. And these are great ways to help yourself be more discoverable to journals who are looking for peer reviewers.
Amazing. I think that's all been very, very helpful advice. We are out of questions, which is good because we are almost out of time. I want to thank you both so much for your presentations and how insightful they've been and actually very practically helpful. I know that a lot of people are definitely going to go away from this feeling like they've learned something really valuable for their careers and their institutions. So just before we wrap up, I know many of you are probably already about to click off, but just before we wrap up, we just do have a few more words. One very, very big word is that we have the annual forum for open research in the Arab world is taking place next month on from the 22nd to the 25th of October in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. There is still lots of time to register. The event is in partnership with UNESCO and Khalifa University, and we have the support of the UAE Ministry of Education and the UAE Ministry of Culture and Youth. So it's incredibly exciting, and there's going to be a lot of networking opportunities with fellow open science experts, advocates, enthusiasts, exhibitors, the works, whatever you want, you will probably find at our annual forum. And this is a great way for you to show your support for open science initiatives in the Arab world and come and participate in a very crucial movement that hopefully will completely change or improve or support research and education institutions in this part of the world, hopefully change them for the better. So seats still are available, and if you scan this QR code that's at the top, you will be able to go straight to the registration page. So that is the annual forum. Otherwise, we do have, all right, it doesn't matter. Otherwise, we do have some other community development activities that are going to be taking place towards the end of this year. In November, we have one with Crossref. In December, we're going to do one with DataSite. Next year, we're planning and finalizing a whole program from start to finish, January to December, that's going to have some very, very interesting and very insightful workshops and webinars at your fingertips. So do keep an eye out on our social media pages, on our Twitter account, and keep your eye out on your email. If you are on our mailing list, we will be sending you notifications whenever the events are coming up. So thank you all. If you could all just take a moment. I know none of us love to do this, but it is incredibly, incredibly valuable for us when you take a moment just to fill out this survey. It helps us understand what we've done well, what we can do better, what you want to see, what you don't want to see for future events. And otherwise, I'd like to thank you all for coming. We're going to leave this QR code up for another 30 seconds, just so that you have the time to snatch it. There's also the link at the bottom, if you prefer to just write it down. I don't know who would want to do that at this day and age, but in case. And otherwise, thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to F1000 for partnering with us at this event. And hopefully we'll see you all in our annual forum next month. And then otherwise, we'll see you at our next community development activity. Thanks, guys.